Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with mini Philly cheesesteaks. That's right, not only are these fun-sized cheesesteaks beautiful and delicious, because we're chopping up the steak, they are very safe to eat. So unlike the Green Bay Packers, there's very little chance of choking. But anyway, cheap shots aside, I thought these came out really well, and this is how we're going to put them together. So first up, we're going to make a roux, and of course that means melting some butter over medium heat and whisking in some flour. And all we're going to do is cook that stirring for a couple minutes until it kind of turns golden. And believe it or not, what we're actually making here is a provolone cheese whiz. You see, the age-old argument in Philly is whether a cheesesteak is best with provolone or cheese whiz. So I decided to take both ideas and do a provolone cheese whiz. And for that, we need a simple white sauce or bechamel, which is what we're making here. So like I said, we're going to cook that butter and flour for a few minutes until it just starts to turn golden, something like this. At which point, we're going to dump in 1 cup of milk. That's right, just dump it all in and then stir. And I know you're nervous. We should have added it gradually and stirred as we went. No, it's okay. Hot roux, cold milk equals no lumps. And once that's mixed in, you're just going to keep stirring. And as it comes up to temperature, it will thicken significantly. So we'll just keep cooking that on medium heat for a few minutes until we have something that looks like this. At which point we can turn off the heat and add the rest of the ingredients, which includes some cayenne pepper. We'll also do a little bit of freshly ground nutmeg, just a hint, and of course a nice big pinch of salt, and we'll stir that in. And then last but not least, I'm going to tear up and add 2 slices of provolone, which is going to be about 2 or 3 ounces worth, depending on the size. Of course, if you're not using sliced provolone, you can just grate it. That seems obvious. And all we need to do is stir that in until it disappears. And what we're left with, we're going to call a provolone cheese whiz. So a pretty simple little cheese spread. In fact, the hardest part is getting the whisk out of the mixture. Come on. There we go. And once that's done, just grab a spatula and transfer that into some kind of container to reserve until needed. So our provolone cheese whiz is done. And at this point, we can move on to the meat. And of course, for cheesesteak, you're going to need some kind of steak. And I'm going to recommend you use skirt steak. Although my butcher was out of it, so I actually use flap meat, which is really similar. And I'll give more info about the steak choices on the blog. But anyway, I'm going to use a nicely marbled piece of flat meat. Pardon the expression. But regardless of the steak you're using, we want to season that very generously on both sides with salt and freshly ground black pepper. And then I want you to cook it any way you want. I'm going to sear mine in a hot pan. You could grill it, you could broil it. It really doesn't matter as long as you cook it somewhere between medium rare and medium. So I went ahead and I cooked my hunk of meat until I thought it was nice and pink inside, at which point I'm going to remove that to a plate to rest. And if you do use a pan to cook yours, which I'm recommending, of course you're going to have a beautiful fond at the bottom of the pan. And you know what we do when we see a fond. So I'm going to throw in a splash of water, and that liquid, of course, is going to release all that amazing caramelized goodness from the bottom of the pan, which we can now add to our resting steak. And then all we need to do is let that meat cool completely before we dice it up. Or if you try to cut that up when it's hot, you're going to lose way too much moisture, and it will get dry. Don't forget, we're going to cook this again. And if for whatever reason you lose the battle of willpower and just eat the steak just like this, no one would blame you. But if you are able to resist, once your meat's cold, we're going to go ahead and dice it up nice and small. And how I like to do this, I like to cut strips with the grain, okay, in the same direction the fibers are going. And then I'll turn those strips this way and cut them into a nice small dice. And of course, I started on the thin side, so that looks a little well done. But you'll see as we cut into it, that meat is nice and pink and juicy. Kind of a key here, because like I said, we are going to cook it again. And once our meat's diced up nice and small, we'll toss that in a bowl. We will pour over all those accumulated juices. And then, just like a real Philly cheesesteak, if you want, we can add the optional peppers and onions, which we're totally going to add. So I added a nice big spoonful of sautéed onions and peppers, which by the way sounds pretty basic, and it is, but I'm actually going to show you this as a separate video because it wasn't just sautéed onions and peppers. It was actually a pickled pepper onion relish that came out incredibly well. So I'm actually going to post that separately as a little extra bonus video. So stay tuned for that. But anyway, like I said, we're going to mix in some sautéed peppers and onions. And obviously this would be the perfect point to taste for seasoning. So taste and adjust. And at that point, we can move on to final assembly. So for the base of our mini cheesesteak, we're going to use slices of baguette. Nice thick slices. And what we'll do is we'll place that down on a foil-lined sheet pan. And we'll drizzle it with some olive oil or melted butter, up to you. But just on one side. Once we drizzle that over the top, we'll flip those over so the oil side's down. And we can move on to spreading these with our provolone cheese whiz. So take a knife or a spreader and put on a fairly generous amount And not only is this going to provide cheesy goodness underneath our steak, it's also going to help keep this bite very moist and succulent. So make sure you're slathering it on nice and thick, getting down into all those nooks and crannies, and just when you think you've put on enough, grab a little bit extra and spread some more on, just to be safe. So that looks good. And then once our bread's been cheesed, we'll top that with a generous spoonful of our chopped steak mixture. So pile it up nice and high like you see here. And once that's been done, the final and most important step, the top cheese. So we got our cheese whiz underneath, but I'm also going to do some strips of provolone over the top, some racing stripes if you will. And again, if you bought a chunk of provolone, you can just grate it and sprinkle it over. But if you got it sliced like me, just cut some strips like this. I believe in French that's bâton de fromage, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm being a little bit reserved here. If you want to top these with a little more cheese, use a little more. I mean, you are the Sylvester Stallone of your provolone. So I'm going to go around and add some more provolone to the top of those, at which point those are ready to place in the center of a 400-degree oven for about 12 to 15 minutes, or until they look like this. If everything's gone according to plan, they should look pretty gorgeous. That cheese on top will have started to bubble and brown. And don't be surprised if your meat got all caramelized around the edges. And that's pretty much it. We'll go ahead and transfer those onto some kind of serving platter, maybe garnish with some freshly chopped chives, and those mini Philly cheesesteaks are done. And these really were amazing. Just beautiful contrasting textures between the crispy edges and bottom and that soft cheese whizzy center. Just a beautiful combination. And the taste, pretty much exactly like a provolone-based Philly cheesesteak. And if you do use a skirt steak or the flat meat like I did, you're going to get a beautiful beefy steak flavor. Despite looking all browned and caramelized, those pieces of meat are still very tender, very moist. So I was just absolutely thrilled with how great these came out. Sure, there was a bunch of steps and a lot of components, but most of it you could do way ahead of time, and then you can just assemble and bake when you're ready to eat. So I really do hope you give this a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.